Hi everyone, my name is Alfredo Ortiz. I'm going to be presenting my case study country, which is Puerto Rico. I'll get a little bit more into why I use the word country later on in this presentation, but for now, I present to you my topics of discussion. I've divided this into three parts: history, government, and status. Status being the colonial slash territorial status of the island and how people are struggling for, be it statehood, be it maintaining the status quo, um, be it asserting themselves as a more sovereign territory of the United States without being explicitly independent or a state, and of course, independence. Government will be more about recent developments in how Puerto Rico has been affected by the colonial condition that they are subjected to by the United States. So first off, we have history, and fun fact, we have the oldest crest in the New World. The crest was the shield with the lamb on it in the previous slide. So the history of Puerto Rico, it starts with, well, just I hate to say that it starts with its European discovery, because there were natives living on the island before. They were called the Taino, and regardless, it was discovered on November 19th, 1493. It was originally called San Juan Bautista or San Bautista, although the name changed because of a cartographical accident wherein the current city of San Juan, which was the original name of the island, was originally called Puerto Rico and was switched. They were accidentally switched, so the island became known as Puerto Rico when the city of Puerto Rico became known as the city of San Juan. So, when Napoleon invaded Spain and the rest of Latin America revolted for their independence, Puerto Rico actually remained aligned with the Spanish king. However, anti colonial sentiments did eventually reach a boiling point. An important revolt was El Grito de Lares in 1868. It was the kind of like the American Revolution, except not as long and not as successful. We did not achieve independence from Spain, but we did achieve expanded autonomy. And I'll get to that in a little bit in the government section. Puerto Rico became subjugated by the United States in 1898 under the Treaty of Paris following the Spanish American War, which was fought between the United States and Spain and resulted in other territories, Spanish territories at the time, such as Cuba, to be signed off to the United States by Spain as war booty. So, about the government. Something that I feel is important to mention is that Puerto Rico is subordinate to the United States government. We are a territory slash colony of the United States. However, Puerto Rico is not afforded all of the protections of the Constitution, according to the insular cases by the Supreme Court. So it leaves up to Congress where it leaves how Puerto Rico is governed, the relationship between the federal government and Puerto Rico. It leaves that up to Congress, and they're not entirely bounded by the Constitution. And that is a big problem because, well, first, you don't have the protections that the Constitution is meant to provide. And of course, Puerto Rico has no voting representation in Congress. So it has no say on whether something becomes a law, regardless of whether it might affect it negatively or positively. So the government of Puerto Rico under Spain was mostly colonial. However, There was a period of expanded autonomy under Spain, wherein Puerto Rico/Spain relations were governed by La Carta Autonómica from 1897 to 1898. Puerto Rico became a territory of the United States after the the Spanish American War, and Puerto Rico was under a United States military regime from the moment they were signed off by the Treaty of Paris to the beginning of the 20th century, which was when the Foraker Act was passed by Congress. Puerto Ricans were not considered United States citizens until 1917, when the Jones Act was passed. And I'd like to take a little moment to highlight something that's very interesting about Puerto Ricans being made citizens in 1917, which was around the time of the First World War. The United States needed soldiers, and Puerto Ricans were persons who were not able to vote, so they would be not included in the war discussion, the discussion surrounding the war. So they made the best soldiers to have, but the problem was that they needed to be citizens before they could be drafted. So a lot of people would indicate that the only reason that Puerto Ricans were made United States citizens in 1917 was so that they could fight in the war. Others would say that it was also done in order to squash the independence movement, but I'll get to that in the status slides. So Puerto Ricans for a long time were not able to elect their governor. So prior to the administration of Luis Muñoz Marin, every governor was appointed by the president. They were not elected by the Puerto Rican people. And many times they were actually not even Puerto Rican. Uh, Luis Muñoz Marin became the first elected governor, and he served from 1949 to 1960, and essentially oversaw the drafting of the first and only constitution of Puerto Rico, which was ratified in 1952. It established a bicameral legislature and three branches of government. It was modeled after the American Constitution and the United States Constitution in many senses, in terms of uh, checks and balances and having what the United States considered to be a quote unquote civilized form of government. Now, it's very interesting because government, ever since the moment of the ratification of the Constitution of Puerto Rico, has been sort of ruled or managed according to Supreme Court precedents or case law, and of course, local constitutional amendments. The problem with the Supreme Court interpreting the laws of Puerto Rico is that since Puerto Ricans do not have voting representation in Congress, they have no say in who becomes a judge who will ultimately decide how much autonomy or lack thereof Puerto Rico has. There was once an attempt at an amendment by the legislature to make Puerto Rico unicameral rather than bicameral. This was a referendum that happened in 2005, but it did not come into fruition. So, on the question of the status, aside from the movements of Puerto Rican statehood, there are also movements for expanded Puerto Rican autonomy as well as Puerto Rican independence. I feel that this is important to mention because a lot of the time that we speak about independence in Puerto Rico, or the overall status, and not necessarily independence, a lot of that translates to a discussion on statehood in the states. So a discussion in Florida might be regarding the status might be about whether or not Puerto Rico should become a state rather than independent. There is not a lot of discussion at the national level on Puerto Rican independence. So Puerto Rico is a colony of the United States. The current relationship between Puerto Rico and the United States has been considered undemocratic and rejected by numerous nations across the globe. The United Nations actually has written and passed many resolutions calling for an end to the colonial situation in Puerto Rico. The virtual absence of the Republican and Democratic parties that are so prominent in the United States politics uh, has resulted in the main Puerto Rican political parties being centered around status, which is, of course, not a problem that states have to concern themselves with because they are already defined as states of the Union. Puerto Rico, on the other hand, has to repeatedly discuss what will come out of what will become of their country. So, on that note, two referendums, one in 2012 with a 78% turnout and one in 2017 with 23% turnout, which I may add is historically low, voted for statehood, but they were not acted upon by Congress. In fact, a lot of the well, actually, every referendum that Puerto Rico has held for the resolution of the status question has been non binding and not recognized by Congress. There have been bills, such as one in 1991 after the collapse of the Soviet Union, that would allow for Puerto Rico to determine whether it would become an independent country with a compact of free association with the United States, or become a state based on referendum. But of course, that bill got shut down, and we haven't seen one since, at least not one like that one ever since. So the discussions surrounding the status problem have been anything but peaceful. Uh, I mean, recently, most of the time we see a discussion on the status during election season in Puerto Rico. But the truth is that not too long ago there were attacks based on the status. For example, persons such as Oscar Lopez Rivera, or Filiberto Hedas, or Pedro Albizu Campos, they would lead nationalist revolutions against, or revolts, I would say. They would lead nationalist revolts or attacks against the colonial government in Puerto Rico, or even go as far as to lead an attack uh, against the United States Congress in order to gain international attention for what they believed to be an unfair and anti democratic situation and relationship between Puerto Rico and the United States. Thank you. This is what I have for the presentation. The if I will add something that is important to take from this is how the history of Puerto Rico ultimately translated to what the government is like, and of course the controversy that comes out of how that government both came to be and what it currently manifests itself as. Of course, with Puerto Rico, everything is based on on the fact that in its 500 years of existence under after the European discovery of the island, for 500 years, the relationship it has had with any country has been colonial in nature. So, of course, that's going to translate a lot into the culture, the government structure, and the rhetoric, political rhetoric that is had surrounding the topic of Puerto Rico. Here are my references, and thank you.